Good morning. It's good to be with you again, albeit virtually, at least a few more weeks. We've made the sudden shift from the Gospel of Mark to the letter of 2 Corinthians. Why? Because it's natural to move from the resurrection story told to the resurrection story applied. So the words in this section of Paul's letter, chapters 3 to 6, so they're very powerful applications of this resurrection truth, but they're also quite raw. They're going to deal with life's struggles, offering us both honesty and encouragement. So today's passages is one of those epic passages that you might see on a Christian t-shirt, you can imagine. We are hard-pressed but not crushed, perplexed but not in despair. But I want us to go past a t-shirt reading of the text, a shallow one, and take a look, as always, at the context, because a lot of the power of the text resides in the context. It's always worth remembering that the words of the Bible, especially the words of a New Testament letter, didn't just pop out of the sky when God declared them to be so. These are the real documents from the lives of real people. Messy, honest, confusing. They give us a glimpse into authentic situations of actual humans trying to figure out what the gospel of Jesus means for their life, especially when they face suffering. More than motivational words, these describe Paul's thoughts in the midst of significant opposition. So, imagine this with me. You are a poor person, a manual laborer who travels around the area selling handcrafted tents. Your life is tough, often dealing with hardships and rejection. Your body aches with difficulties too numerous to count, and to tell the truth, you're not much to look at. You used to have a more glamorous life, respected, educated, wealthy, aligned with the powers that be. But then that all changed when a mysterious divine encounter left you altered forever and totally shifted your worldview and everything you thought you knew. Now, in the second half of your life, you've committed your life to the cause of planting communities of faith all over the map. You present the good news as you understand it, but you're not a great public speaker, and your message is radical, so you receive a lot of hate. You do have your occasional successes, though, like getting to see churches in Corinth grow up and mature. This church in particular, you've nurtured it with visits and letters for over a decade. And when they face their own trials, you have poured your heart into them, counseling, comforting, encouraging them, until they turn on you. So those people that you loved, the people that have grown up before your eyes, that church, well, they've started listening to other teachers that convince them that you are a failure and not to be listened to. The whole community starts to disassociate themselves from you. And you can't believe it because this community wouldn't even exist without you. The teachers, and thus the people, start examining your life, your recent mess and tragedy, and they say that your suffering disqualifies you from being a true apostle. Besides, these other teachers, these other leaders are much more impressive, eloquent, convincing. So why bother with Paul anymore? Let us understand just how difficult a situation Paul finds himself in with this church in Corinth. He's confused and heartbroken. In his final letter to them, he tries to defend himself from these accusations, and in so doing, writes some of his most stirring and striking words that you will ever read. He says, and I'll paraphrase a bit here, I, and you who are with me in the ways of Jesus, we are like jars of clay, fragile, unadorned, cracked, chipped, unimpressive. On the outside, not much to look at, but on the inside, we have a treasure, the good news of the kingdom of God. If you look at me alone, Paul seems to be saying, you might well miss the brightness. But there's power inside, all surpassing power. And this is just the way it's meant to be, because this way you'll know that this power comes from God and not from me. This way you won't mistake the ordinary messenger for the extraordinary message. Indeed, at this time, it was common practice to hide actual treasure in clay jars because no one would suspect to look in them. The exterior of the jars didn't attract attention to the riches of the interior. And apparently, this is a metaphor for us too. Let's be honest. I don't really think any of us are fooling ourselves. Most of us, myself included, are quite ordinary people. And although maybe you've never thought of yourself as a clay pot before, it's not a bad metaphor for our lives, actually. How would you describe your faith life, particularly during the pandemic? Is it flashy, impressive, amazing? Probably not. How about ordinary, humbling, inconsistent? Let me tell you, it's okay if your day-to-day faith life seems rather plain, especially on the outside. Even if you think of people whose faith you admire, isn't it true that the more you get to know them, what you discover is that their faith too consists of ordinary decisions, one moment at a time. They're clay pots, just like us. Ordinary, and the other thing is that clay pots are quite fragile. So are we. Now, the fragility of life is something that some of us are more familiar with than others. But anyone who's lost a loved one or suffered a mental breakdown knows that life's good and stable moments are not to be taken for granted. For my family, we have seen the fragility of life up close this past year, both in death and in pregnancy. And the impression that experience leaves upon us is that life is just so precious. We're clay pots, yes, ordinary and fragile. But, Paul says, our lives contain the gospel treasure. How is the good news of God like a treasure in our lives? I'll quickly summarize my understanding of the good news. That God, in his love, decided to intervene in history, bringing about a long-awaited victory over evil and rescuing his people, accomplished through this triumphant act of self-giving love in Jesus' death, followed by the inauguration of the kingdom, that is the ongoing movement of new creation in Jesus' resurrection. That gospel story is the story that gives all of our stories meaning and purpose. The story that we find ourselves in, whether we know it or not. This story is a treasure because it reminds us of our infinite value. It fills us with the Spirit to transform our life and gives us power to join God in his work of bringing justice, reconciliation, and wholeness to the world. It's actually a good thing that our faith isn't flashy or impressive. If it was, people might think that this story, this treasure, was all about us rather than about Jesus. One of my favorite quotes, and I've used this before, is from Don Miller when he says, "The most difficult lie I have ever contended with is this, that life is a story about me." There are certain distortions of the Christian narrative that tell us that true faith will bring us prestige or wealth or worldly power. Rather, the opposite is often true. The downward journey is the one that we are often called on, not the path of upward mobility. In fact, in terms of understanding, I think, the true nature of our faith, one of the most important verses is the one that begins the Sermon on the Mount, which we studied last year. "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." In other words, those that confess their spiritual bankruptcy are the ones that live in the power of the kingdom. When we abandon our pretenses, stop hiding behind our privilege, and begin to cast our dependence on God, then we'll start to submit to the operation of the kingdom in our lives. When we admit that actually we really are like jars of clay, then the treasure inside begins to take center stage. What Paul says next is the part that really belongs on a t-shirt. He says, "We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed. Perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed." But again, remember the context. Someone beaten down by circumstance, rejected by community. These are not abstract t-shirt adjectives that describe general hardships. These are specific descriptions of what Paul has gone through, surrounded by troubles, at his wit's end, spiritually terrorized, imprisoned. The list goes on, and there is a list. If you know Paul's story, you'll know what I mean. Paul, and many other Christians at the time, were the subject of the most horrendous of treatments. Just a few chapters earlier, in chapter 1 though, Paul describes how it felt in those moments of difficulty. He says, "We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about the troubles we experienced in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt we had received the sentence of death." That's just 3 chapters earlier. So many times in his life already, Paul thought it was over. He thought he was toast, thought that his life as he knew it had come to an end. His journey's finished. And yet, he survived. Ultimately, he wasn't crushed, never abandoned or destroyed. God was with him. God pulled him through. But that doesn't mean that in the moment, it didn't feel like he was being crushed, abandoned, or destroyed. It did feel that way. But with hindsight, Paul sees that it wasn't the end. Can you think of times in your life when you really did think that your life was effectively over? Whether literally or figuratively. But in the end, that experience, though difficult, didn't actually defeat you. What this sermon lacks, what it really needs, is a good story right around here. But I'm going to leave that for your small groups. Please share stories. This truth that our sufferings and difficulties don't actually have to end us, it should be a comfort for us who are currently going through persecution, tragedy, suffering. It may feel like this is the end, but it's not. Tough times don't last forever, and God brings redemption one way or another. Our struggles, in the end, do not define us and do not end us. At least not in the most ultimate and truest way. And by that I'm referring to God's ultimate plan of new creation. Yes, people do die. Tragedies can feel and appear insurmountable in this life. But God's plan and his storyline are always bigger than our own lives. I don't mean to be overly simplistic here. Perhaps you question my words. And I do want to acknowledge that coming from a place of privilege myself makes it easier for me to say this. But I also want to acknowledge the mystery of the gospel at work in our lives. I think of our friend, Mel Slade. When you go down the steps in his backyard, at the very bottom, at the entrance to his garden, there's a plaque in memory of his wife. And the words on that plaque have always struck me. They say, "In memory of Betty Lou Slade." The blossoms of Beaton Ridge Gardens reflect Betty Lou's beauty. They also remind us of the many seeds that Betty Lou has sown and patiently tended with care, blooming eternally in the lives of others. It's beautiful. Whether you can see your own personal experience meshing with Paul's here, I don't know. Whether you see a point or an end to your suffering, I also don't know. Paul probably didn't see an end to it either. His beloved Corinthian church has turned against him. And for all he knows, they would never turn back. But Paul goes deeper in the last part of this section, and he gets to the real heart of his defense. He says, "We all always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may also be revealed in our mortal body. So then, death is at work in us, but life is at work in you." Do we need a translation here? It's pretty dense language. It's not just that Paul sees his afflictions as merely temporary or finite. It's that he sees his sufferings as a living out of the gospel. When he suffers, his sufferings are in some way part of Christ's sufferings, which of course lead to resurrection. Paul sees his story as somehow taken up into the grand story of Christ's cosmic death and life. In this case, there are a lot of specific similarities between Paul's life and Christ's. Trial, torture, mockery, persecution. It's a reenactment, Paul's life, of the passion of the Christ. And both stories lead to the flourishing of the kingdom. That is, the early church on the shores of the Mediterranean. Remember, when Paul says all this stuff about Christ's death and his body, this is a response to the teachers in Corinth saying that Paul's suffering disqualifies him from being an apostle. So how is this a defense against that accusation? In essence, he says that his way of life and leadership is actually the proof that he authentically represents the crucified and risen Jesus. His goal is that his life and ministry imitate the cross. And so his sufferings don't invalidate his leadership. It actually confirms it, because it's part of the deal of what it means to follow Jesus. Let me say that again with a different focus. Suffering doesn't invalidate your ability to live out the gospel. It's actually proof that you're already doing it. Maybe we feel like we carry around in us some inherent disqualification, failure, tragedy, illness. But perhaps that is a way for the life of Jesus to be revealed in our body, as Paul says. What a thought. And again, I don't mean to explain away suffering, especially on a day like this, marking a grim anniversary in Nova Scotia. But this thought that Jesus' life can be revealed in our death is definitely something to give some thought to today. We are all called to the cruciform way of life. That is the cross-shaped journey. That's what cruciform means, cross-shaped journey. It's a journey of self-giving love, sacrificial actions, and defiant trust in God's faithfulness in the midst of our suffering. Of course, this invitation from Christ can seem quite uninviting. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. What kind of fate awaits us when we accept Christ's call? It sounds grisly, certainly unpleasant. Jesus goes on, "For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it." We're not just talking about literal death. The ways of self-indulgence, self-satisfaction, consumption, they only make our lives smaller and meaner. And it turns out that the way of self-forgetfulness, self-denial, and sacrifice is actually a way of thriving. It's the way of rich relationships, the way of vibrant community life. Strange as it may seem, it is the way of death that gives birth to life. If we want to live out the gospel, we have to remember that it includes death in some way. Spring always comes, but never until winter has run its course. Winter actually enables the spring. And I speak here on a spring day when it's snowing outside, and I know it's not necessarily a linear relationship in Halifax. We need the night before the dawn. We need the darkness of the solstice before the sun will begin to appear again. As you can tell, I've really begun to appreciate lately how the story of Christ is woven into and revealed in the rhythms of nature, of the cosmos. Back in December, we were in Ottawa, and I was reading a book about the ancient practices of the Celtic Christians, especially as they celebrated the winter solstice, the days leading up to Christmas. They had certain prayers, certain things that they remembered. It was a dark time for us personally. We were faced with the impending loss of my father-in-law. Every day, it felt like it could have been the day. And when we came into the hospital on December 26th, it was just minutes after he had passed away. And so we sat in the room with alternating periods of silence and outward grief. And the words of a prayer came to me from that book. It's a solstice prayer. The solstice, of course, being not only the day when the darkness is at its deepest, but also the day when we believe that the sun will begin to return. So I read this prayer, which was inspired by the ancient Celts for the solstice day. And I read this prayer to the body, to my family, and to God. And this is how the prayer went. Be still. Be in this hallowed darkness. Be in this deepest dark that we have traveled since November. We pray to know that this darkness can be the womb from which Christ's new radiance is born. It was a prayer of grief that gave words to something so painful that it couldn't be expressed. It's a prayer also of hope, that somehow things would get better, and that this death would be followed by birth. If you know what's going on in my life right now, you know birth is coming sometime this summer. This death-life story, it is literal in my life right now in a few ways. I can't help but see some of that evidence in Allison's acceptance to medical school. So here's the moment, a public congratulations for that major accomplishment. I know for many of us, this death-life story is not a literal one, but it's also an inner one, as we battle with our own self to follow the cruciform way, the cross-shaped journey, which can be just so full of obstacles and setbacks. Our faith lives on a knife edge. Sometimes it seems like we're perilously close to losing everything, and at any moment we could find ourselves losing our grip, hurtling downward. What gives us security when our faith itself seems to be so inconsistent, so insecure, so much like a jar of clay, fragile and unassuming? What gives us security? Well, it's the treasure inside. The resurrection hope that is beyond us and within us. In fact, our faith is genuine only when we refuse to seek a false sense of security. When we look unflinchingly at all that is dangerous and dark in life and in death, acknowledging that there is no truly safe place for us in this world, and clinging to the conviction that there is one who will hold us, even when we fall. Disappointment happens, but discouragement is a choice in many ways. When suffering hits, we can choose to make the impossible choice and be encouraged that your story is part of something bigger. Redemption is at hand, and that Jesus Christ is risen from the dead. His power is made all the more evident when we stumble, and your suffering can actually reveal your dependence on God. And this is at the heart of Paul's defense. Hear it again. I'll read the passage one more time as we finish, and I want you to listen for how your story fits into this one. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may also be revealed in our mortal body. So then, death is at work in us, but life is at work in you. Amen.